So welcome to the politics of the past in post-socialist spaces, which is a topic we've already discussed in some of the earlier panels as well, but now we've got a full panel for this. Some people are still coming in from the lunch break, for those of you online, but we'll just go ahead and start. And our first paper is by Tamar Karaia. And she has a PhD in political science from the Tbilisi State University, where she is an associate professor, and she works on memory politics, identity formation, and social movements. And she has a fascinating paper on foreign policy priorities as a factor in the formation of memory policy in post-Rose Revolution Georgia. So, Tamar, the floor is yours, 20 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much. I think it works or not. Yes. First, hello everyone. Thank you for this very interesting conference. And I would like to share with you the politics of memory and its peculiarities after Rose Revolution in Georgia. I have to say that after regaining independence in Georgia, we have a few initiatives, memory-related initiatives, but during the first two presidents, Gamsakhourdia and Shevardnadze, they were mostly related to the upgrading textbooks and upgrading legislation, and only after the Rose Revolution, we see the clear developed memory policy. So I have conducted this research within the framework of my dissertation, and I was overviewing the speeches of the President Mikhail Saakashvili from 2003 until 2012, and I found out that there is very interesting, how to say, directions in his speeches, and based on the analysis of the speeches, we can find out the main directions of the memory policy. So my research based on the analysis, qualitative analysis of the speeches of the president, also analyze the reports of the different commission, also newspapers and papers from printed and social media. The general question and the main aim of my research was to analyze what was the main determinator and the factor of the developing memory policy in the post-Rose Revolution Georgia. Please, can you slide the, it's, I have to mention that when the Saakashvili came to the power, its background was quite different, because he declared that he's going to start the build-up statehood anew, because previous government, the government of Gamsakhourdia and government of Shevardnadze, was quite degraded. They were ineffective, they were corrupted, etc. And the government that came to the power after the Rose Revolution had quite a higher trust from the government, a higher level of legitimacy. So they declared that they are going to statehood anew, and correspondingly they needed to unite country. I mean, Georgia is a quite multicultural society, and our Soviet legacy, the main Soviet legacy was that the representatives of different minorities were quite, how to say, atomized in their communities. So when I analyzed the speeches of Saakashvili, I found out that there is a two, how to say, periods, and these periods correspond different directions of the memory policy. From 2003 until 2005, at the end of 2005, we see that the memory mostly was oriented to recall the stories from the past. And from 2006 until 2012, we see the construction of the collective memory of the victims of Soviet occupation. Actually, start from the beginning, from 2003. As I mentioned, Saakashvili started building the statehood anew, and new society needed the new symbols, a new anthem, new flag, new coat of arms, and actually, if we are using the Assmann's theory, they started to actualize and become these symbols of part of everyday life. And another important direction of this policy was they started to recall the Georgian heroic past, the heroes who managed to survive, heroes that managed to gather and to take the glory to the Georgians, and that was the result why when the Saakashvili came to power, he delivered his inaugurational oath to the tomb at the tomb of David the Builder. David the Builder is the biggest Georgian king of, from the 11th century, and there was a very interesting narrative in the Saakashvili speeches that first ever in Georgia. So after the Rose Revolution, it was the first time when country could conduct reforms, when citizens could collect themselves and build up quite new country. And side by side, recalling the heroes from the history, he was also highlighted that we have a contemporary heroes. Contemporary heroes are good citizens, soldiers, doctors, teachers, and etc. And if heroes manage to survive and bring us independence, contemporary heroes are including in the state development process. When I analyzed why the government chose that type of way of the memory development, I found out that it was absolutely related to the Russian factor. You know that from the 1801, Georgia was, occupied by the Russian monarchy. Then from 1921, Soviet Russia, and that's why when the Saakashvili came to the power, he declared that he's going to upgrade also Georgian-Russian relation, and that's why from 2003 until 2005, you won't find any words in the Georgian political discourse relating to the occupation, aggression, Soviet Union, etc., because they started not forgetting but keeping a neutral manner evaluation of the Russia, because it had several reasons. The first, Russia was the main market for the Georgian products. The huge immigration from Georgia to Russia lived there and send money back to country, and also the Russia delivered the energo supplies to Georgia, and the final Georgian military bases were detached in Georgia. These were the general reasons why Georgian government decided to keep silence regarding the Russian factor in Georgian, Abkhazian, and Georgian South Ossetian problem. Maybe you already know that the 20% of Georgia is occupied by Russia, including Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And this type of memory policy continued until 2005. And 2005 is the period when on the political stage appeared former KGB leaders from the Russia. And also this is the time when Saakashvili declared that a country will apply for the NATO or European structure, and after that the Georgian relation become worse. And there appeared several signs of this type of worsening. The first was that they organized terroristical acts in the Shida Kartli. It's the territory which is right now part of the South Ossetia. Also, there were several subversive acts were occurred on the declines, and because of this, almost the entire population of the country were cut off electricity and gas, and also Georgian immigrants from Russia, immigrants from the Georgia, were sent to the country, deported from Russia, and the final aspect was when embargo was imposed to the Georgian products. And after that, in the political discourse of Georgia, you will find that Russia is not the good neighbor, but Russia is enemy, and we have to name the proper names, and we have to evaluate who is our friend and who is our enemy. And after that, in the February of 25, in 2006, Saakashvili went to the Kojer-Tapach-Mela. It's a place where occurred the battle between Russia and Georgia, and he tribute to the soldiers and said his very famous speech about the orientation that is directly connected to the memory. He said that Georgians had to decide which day they should celebrate. But if they will celebrate the 23rd of February, the day of Soviet soldiers, that means that they will be returned to the Russian orientation. But if they will pay tribute to the 25th of February as a day of Soviet occupation, that means that they will remember what was the result of Russian occupation, and also they will join to the European family, and actually this case shows us very well how in Georgia memory policy development is directly related to the foreign policy priorities. Actually, if we use the Sontag theory about why memory needs corresponding pictures and places, in post-2006 time, we see how this type of narratives with, followed by the memory places, memory sites. Even that day, Saakashvili declared that they are going to establish the museum, occupation museum, and to make remembered which we have already forgotten, how cruel Soviet Union, not the Soviet Union, but Russian Empire and Soviet Union and today's Russia was in Georgia. And after that, they established the occupation museum. Then next, yes, and the next memory site they established was collecting to the which day we should remember and celebrate. It's 8 May as the end of the Great Patriotic War, or 8 May as end of the Second World War, or 9 May as end of the Great Patriotic War. And the beginning of the discussion was the base to the greetings of Dmitry Medvedev when 2009, after the Georgian-Russian war in August, he congratulated to the Georgian people and to the Georgian veterans and said that Georgia and Russia have common past that should be celebrated together. And Georgian government was quite upset because from these greetings they were absolutely, missed. And after that they decided that yes, we have to celebrate 8 May as the end of Second World War because it's a European narrative, and because we are choosing European narrative to being a part of European family, that's why we have to celebrate this day. And another interesting decision was to establish commission for establishing of the historical trust. The current government of the Saakashvili thought that they have to prepare the memory templates. The narrative, there would be written the pros and cons of Georgian-Russian relations. And this memory narrative narratives have to describe of 20 years of 200 years of experience. According to his statute, the final product must be prepared for the internal using, for the Georgians, but then they decided to switch the final product to the external, using. But actually, the establishing of commission was at the very last time of his presidency, when in 2012 the Georgian government changed. The new government absolutely changed the direction of memory policy on Georgia, and because of they were trying to upgrade Georgian-Russian relation, they decided to mute this process. And if we analyze, we can conclude several conclusions of about the general tendencies of memory policies, post-revolution memory policies in Georgia. Actually, memory policy was absolutely top-down oriented, and citizen engagement in this process was quite limited. That's why when we are analyzing how influential this type of memory policy was, we can say that it was not influential at all. And main determinant of this process was, as I mentioned, the relation of the Russian Federation, where Georgian-Russian relation was normal and more, positive. Actually, the Russian topics was absolutely missed from this context, but when the Russian-Georgian relation become worse, of course, we have quite a counter-Russian narrative in Georgia. And also it's interesting that after war in Ukraine, in Georgia, we have quite different direction of memory policy construction. When civil society representatives decided to build up a new tendency, to promote a new tendency of bottom-up construction of memory policy, and right now we have quite a strong level of direction that before Bucha there was Abkhazia, to remember and recall the massacres and the crimes that was done in Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and yeah, fascinating paper and case study of really how the memory politics and policy is being formulated in reaction to a neighboring country and these bilateral relations. So lots of material there, and just also I remember the destruction of that very large World War II memorial, which I think was done in that time frame. Okay, we're moving on to our next paper and our next presenter. We only have one presenter here from the duo who prepared the paper. This is Aijan Sharshenova, and she's a postdoctoral research fellow at the Volkswagen Foundation, Volkswagen Foundation at the OSCE Academy in Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan. She holds a PhD in politics from the University of Leeds in UK, and before she had joined the OSCE Academy, she never worked for the OSCE, as she told us over lunch, but she had worked for the UN and USAID, I believe. And her present research project is on Russia's soft power and public diplomacy in Central Asia. And she's also recently has a book out, The European Union's Democracy Promotion in Central Asia. So the title of her paper is Memory Sites, Post-Soviet Nostalgia in Bishkek and Russian Public Diplomacy. Okay, you have 20 minutes.
Great, thank you very much. Is it working? Yep, yeah, okay, cool, thank you. Right, so yeah, the topic is memory sites, post-Soviet nostalgia in Bishkek and Russian public diplomacy. So this is a co-authored project. Dr. Zarina Adambussinova is my co-author. Unfortunately, she couldn't make it to Poland today, but we have done the work together and we are intending to continue working together on this specific project. I usually start my presentations with a note on my positionality, and because there are two of us, there are two positionalities over there. Why I think that is important? Because who we are and where we come from, what sort of education we get, what sort of training we get, affects how we see the world, what sort of information we have access to, and our cognitive ability as well. So we are both Volkswagen Foundation grantees. There is a long list of disclaimers, which I'm not going to read because it's going to take a lot of time. We also work for fairly Western institutions, research hubs in Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan. We are coming from different backgrounds in terms of professional training. I'm a political scientist with a focus on international politics. And Zarina is a social anthropologist, so she's way more prepared to work on this project. I basically bring the Russian public diplomacy side of things, and she brings everything else. Now, we both have Western education, and I think the similarity in terms of training also affected that academically, we speak the same language, basically. We are Russian speakers, and that affected our access to the information, and also certain cultural codes that we share with the Russian public and the former Soviet Union. We are ethnically not Russian, obviously, so we're Kyrgyz and Kazakh, and I guess that affects as well how we see things and where we find ourselves in terms of self-reflection and self-identification when doing research. And finally, we were born in the USSR, which affects our family cultural codes. So in a way, the emotive responses to what we see and what is nostalgia, because family history is obviously very important as well. Our parents have gone through the full cycles of Soviet socialization. They were part of the Homo Sovieticus, obviously, and they brought a bit of it to us as well. A bit of a project background. So actually, Zarina and I met each other within the framework of the Volkswagen Foundation's grant scholarship as postdocs. We met at the selection process, basically. We simply clicked because we come from different backgrounds in terms of academic research, but in terms of everything else, we're like mere reflection of each other. And she suggested that we apply to a platform called SMD, which might be interesting for you, dear experts in memory studies and historians, because it's a grassroots interdisciplinary platform in Kyrgyzstan, which focuses and works on reshaping and shifting the perceptions of history from top-down approaches to bottom-up approaches. So they're trying to rebuild the history of the Kyrgyz Republic from the point of view of people of Kyrgyzstan, not from the point of view of the Soviet state or the Kyrgyz independent state. So they launched a program called Living Memory, and we joined the program. It's actually a school where they create a platform and we have discussions to talk through our perceptions of history and our projects. We actually, the original purpose of our research project was to produce a multimedia piece of work. So it wasn't an academic piece of work, it was a media work. It's a long read for Kabar Asia, an analytical platform in Central Asia, which we published this year. I think it was May or June time. So it's not particularly academic, but we've done a huge amount of field work. So originally we were hoping to do like 3,000–4,000 words, but we ended up with like 7,000–8,000 words. And we realized we have plenty of empirical knowledge, which could be supplemented with theoretical foundation and published as a joint article. So we started working on that, and this is a work in progress. Well, a bit of theory. Again, I bring like a quarter of theory to the table. Zarina brings the other 3/4 of theory to the table. So we starting point for memory politics apparently is Aleida Asman, a person I have discovered this year, as well as Pierre Nora, which is really fascinating. There is also a phenomenon of post-Soviet nostalgia, which is very typical to Eastern European studies and less so to Central Asian studies. So this is an under-researched area for our field of work, regional studies. And finally, what I bring to the table is public diplomacy and soft power, and I focus on Russia. Now, Russian public diplomacy is a very controversial subject nowadays, and it was quite unfortunate that I started my research project on Russian soft power in the times of COVID first, followed with the war in Ukraine. So it's been quite difficult to implement my project, but nevertheless, it's quite interesting to look at public diplomacy, what it is and how it works on the ground. We did a lot of field work, so in terms of time frame, we worked from October 2021, and it's still ongoing. We had the first initial data collection period, which ended on the 9th of May with the participation in the Immortal Regiment in Bishkek. The location was Bishkek, so we focused on the post-Soviet city of Bishkek. And the fieldwork sites were really exciting, really, because we had a chance to basically think outside of the box, look at Bishkek not as residents, but as researchers. So we were just wandering around the city and trying to spot the pockets of Soviet nostalgia or pockets of Soviet memory in the city of Bishkek. We had 3 primary case studies, or locations. I'll talk in more detail later. So the first one is the Russian Drama Theater in Bishkek. It's a quite old institution. The second one is a small state-owned museum, a home museum named after Mikhail Frunze, a Russian settler colonialist and a revolutionary, and actually a founder of the Red Army, or the original organizer of the Red Army. And the final, it's not exactly a memory site, it's actually a commemorative practice. It was the Immortal Regiment, which was held in Bishkek. It's held annually, and it follows the Russian tradition of those immortal regiments, the recent one as well. But in addition to that, we actually have gone to flea markets to see how Soviet nostalgia is commercialized and sold. We went to local pubs, that's probably the best one, because everything Soviet sells. We also went to a cafe or tea house, which had a thematic room of Soviet Union, but we did not thought that it was a commercialized history. We felt it was more therapeutic. It was therapeutic to the owner of the cafe, who wanted to recreate the interiors of his youth, but also to the attendees of that tea house, because they just liked sitting in the, it was like a time capsule. Basically, you walk in and you have those old suitcases and old clocks and TV stands, all from Soviet Union. So it's quite interesting that you have those spatial time capsules within contemporary Bishkek. Right. Now, data collection was mixed. We did participant observation. Kudos to Zarina, because she's gone to Russian Drama Theater. I'm not a very cultural person, so I'm not a big fan of theater. So I did make it once over there, but she's been going there regularly. So she tried to attend as many performances as possible, just to get the feel of what sort of contents are presented at the theater. What sort of narratives are there, what sort of audiences come to the theater, what sort of reactions they exhibit. So the one we've gone to, the one that I have a picture from, we actually witnessed some people crying. And it was an odd experience, because obviously we are fairly young, probably not as emotionally attached to the Soviet Union, but some people in the room were older, very nostalgic about the Soviet Union, and they were literally crying their eyes out, which was a bit of an awkward experience. We also did some semi-structured interviews, which was a bit challenging, because in Russian Drama Theater is a very small institution. The museum named after Frunze is even a smaller institution. And both are owned by the government, and government is a bit icky about addressing the Soviet past. So basically, the current employees of both institutions were not particularly cooperative, so they did not want to talk about that, because it's a sensitive issue. But what we did, we supplemented it with the interviews of former museum staff. On the top of that, we tried to get as much information as possible from the attendees of the performances. We also booked a whole bunch of paid tours at the museum. I think I told about that yesterday. We employed my students, my partner Zarina, her husband. So we've been going on the tours again and again, asking them to speak to us in Russian and English, explaining that it's an educational purpose, or it's an entertainment purpose, or we're just curious just to hear how different tour guides present the history of that home museum. We also did archival research, and we are continuing that, because we need to see the coverage of the post-Soviet memory sites functioning in the past 30 years, how they have transformed. And we are doing content analysis of newspapers. Now, key hypothesis, that this is work in progress again, so we don't have the findings yet. So what we discovered so far is that the post-Soviet nostalgia in the contemporary Bishkek has very different formats. It could be therapeutic practices of getting together and reminiscing about the Soviet past, romanticizing the Soviet past, glamorizing it, as in case of the pub. Actually, the pub was selling not just Soviet stuff, but also pin-up, really like American pin-up style imagery. So I was quite curious to see marks next to sexy girls in retro outfits. We also think that some of the practices, they are formal and informal. So there is formality and informality in the practices. There is also a dialectics of personal and the public. And that was especially evident in the Immortal Regiment. But the part that I bring to the table is what we realized in our exploration is that in a lot of places and practices of post-Soviet nostalgia, there is an element of Russian involvement. So it could be financial involvement. Sometimes it's the embassy that's sponsoring certain events. It could be ideological involvement. Sotrudnichestvo is often present or mentioned in the interviews. And then when we came to the Immortal Regiment, it was cultural as well. It was a massive cultural diplomacy. So we felt that only Russia has the right to that memory, the memory of the Second World War, and Russia dictates how it should be perceived and portrayed and accepted. Now, we looked at different case studies. The first case study is a Russian drama theater. It's an old establishment. There are actually two public Soviet theaters in Bishkek. One is a Kyrgyz drama theater, another one is a Russian drama theater. Now, the Kyrgyz drama theater has been different always, even in the Soviet times. It was showing performances in Kyrgyz language, which was quite rare back then. But Russian drama theater has not transformed as much as Kyrgyz drama theater. So up until now, it shows the classic theatrical performances of the Soviet times or traditional Russian authors. Surprisingly enough, it's named after a Kyrgyz writer, Chingiz Aytmatov, but it does not have any performances based on the writings of Chingiz Aytmatov, even though Chingiz Aytmatov is a very prolific writer. So Chingiz Aytmatov's works are actually presented in the Kyrgyz drama theater. And what we found so far, that I'm not going to talk about the historical background because it's too much. The drama theater in the independent Kyrgyz period, it lived through hardships, financial hardships. It had both commercial and non-commercial sponsorship. The repertoire is very Russian, very Soviet. The audience, surprisingly enough, is mostly Russian speakers and mostly older people and mostly ethnic Russians. So that was quite curious for us as well, because when we came to the performance, I think in the whole room, which is like double the size of this one, there were only 4 non-Russians. So it was myself and Zarina and a young Kyrgyz couple. So that was quite curious how we found ourselves over there. We definitely stood out. And there is Russian involvement. The artistic director of the Russian drama theater is actually the head of the Union of Female Compatriots of Russians. So it's a an association closely affiliated with the Russian embassy and Sotrudnichestvo. Now, the Home Museum of Mikhail Frunze, it's an interesting one because it shows both colonial history, because Frunze was born in the Tsarist Russia, and he is a descendant of settler colonialists from actually Moldova. He's half Moldovan. But he played a massive role in the formation of the Soviet state and the Red Army. So a lot of the exhibition was devoted to his life. But surprisingly enough, we were told by some of the older tour guides that the script of the tours has not changed, or the contents of the museum have not changed since the 70s. So the last proper revision was happening like 50 years ago. They do small adjustments, mostly to reflect on the independent period of Kyrgyzstan, but they don't challenge history, or they don't address history through the Kyrgyz lenses, so to say. So it's still a very Soviet thing. And even the department within the museum that is responsible for doing the tours is still called Отдел пропаганды. So it's called the propaganda unit, which was quite curious. It's a very small museum. It's literally just director and maybe like 4 units with 1 person or 2 persons within the unit. Now, there's certainly a strong element of ideology back then, but also now. And it's a split ideology. On one hand, it's a location for ethnic Russian speakers as well to come and talk about the history of the Soviet Union and how good it was. But it's also a location of the military history. So the National Guard of the Kyrgyz Republic, the recruits are obliged to come once a year to listen to lectures and look at the glory of the Red Army, which they have no connection to whatsoever. There is also a split debate about the future of the museum, because I think even our government understands that museum in its current format might be good for researchers like ourselves, the researchers who research post-Soviet nostalgia, but not for the purposes of ideology or memory keeping. So they're thinking to transform it. And there is a fight actually between the city, because the city wants to make it a museum of the city, and the military. The military want to keep it to themselves, and they want to have a museum devoted to the military history of the Kyrgyz Republic. Now, this is probably one of the more interesting ones and more active and large-scale parts of our fieldwork that we've done. I don't know to what extent you're familiar with Immortal Regiment, but original idea was actually a bottom-up human history. So originally it was created in the city of Tomsk in Russia by a media company and civil activists in the city. So what they wanted to do, they wanted to shift the focus of the history of the Second World War, form the state narratives of heroism and sacrifice and all of it, to the individual histories of humans who actually fought the war or lived through the war in the Soviet Union. However, that's the top logo. That's the original creators, and they're still around there. The second logo is actually a state-sanctioned Besmetny Polk or Immortal Regiment, Russian Federation. So it's a separate organization which is headed by a member of Russian parliament, who is also a member of the Committee on Ideology. So you can imagine what sort of stuff they promote. This year, the original creators of Besmetny Polk, they declared that they expressed the word. It was very carefully worded statement, but they expressed the concern that this year's Immortal Regiment is going to be used for ideological purposes to justify the war in Ukraine. And they distanced themselves from that. Nevertheless, Immortal Regiments still happen, and they happened in Bishkek as well. Now, commemoration of the Second World War, it's a must in Kyrgyzstan. It was both official and unofficial, and we were honestly a bit concerned about going to the Immortal Regiment this year for the same reasons why the original organizers were concerned. We thought it's going to turn into, a militarized festival. So I was a bit, we were genuinely worried that it's going to turn into a support action of the war in Ukraine. But it wasn't. Surprisingly, it wasn't. It was 15,000 people attending, and every single person who was there, they came for a different reason. And it was seen in the Battle of Ribbons. It was really interesting because people were wearing ribbons, and some of them were the orange and black ones, as on the portrait of Stalin, and that's the St. George's ribbon, which is a symbol of the Soviet Red Army, but also the symbol of colonization of Central Asia, because the medal for the colonization of Central Asia in the Tsarist Russia was accompanied with that ribbon. Now, Kyrgyz government created a separate ribbon to distance itself from that ribbon, so you can see it on the other side of the slide. It's in the colors of the Kyrgyz flag, so it's yellow and red. Kazakhstan did a similar thing. They have a turquoise-colored, the blue-colored ribbon as well. We saw some Russian tricolor ribbons as well, so people were supporting the Russian war in Ukraine. There was Z signs as well, even though they are prohibited by a decree by the security services. You could be fined with about 50 euros fine if you wear it in public in Kyrgyzstan, but nevertheless, they still wore it. Now, the Immortal Regiment was an interesting thing because, first of all, we saw quite a lot of Russian involvement on the financial side of things. So there were different locations of public entertainment, performances, singing, dancing, free food, and so on and so forth. And the logos were curious because they were Россотрудничество logos. They were logos of public associations affiliated with the Russian Federation, of the discussion platforms that promote Eurasianism. The organization called Harmony, and Harmony is famous because they're trying to screen propaganda films about Donbass and the war in Ukraine. They were trying to do a festival in Bishkek, but that was prohibited as well after a public outcry. But it was quite curious that Russia was present and not present. So it wasn't like in your face, but you needed to be able to read the logos to understand like who's funding what. So we could do that, so we did that. Now, our research is still in the making. I'm going to take an extra minute. There are limitations to it because obviously Russian public diplomacy actors are not particularly keen to talk to researchers. I've been trying to access them for about 2 years now, but they think I'm either a spy or I'm there to criticize them. So I gave up on that. But we thought that we could collect other data. For example, the coverage in mass media throughout 30 years of Kyrgyzstan, the interviews with museum workers as well. We also were hoping to search for a theoretical foundation. That's why we're presenting here. We want to hear from you as well. And I've been taking quite a lot of notes with different names because for me it's a totally new field. But we also want to focus on policy implications for the Kyrgyz government and Kyrgyz public, because the reason why Russia is very much present in terms of commemorative practices and post-Soviet nostalgia is because the Kyrgyz government does not engage in a meaningful way with the past. So the past is either ignored, misremembered, or silenced. And in the vacuum of the public, honest, uncomfortable conversations about the past, you have foreign actors who are trying to take over the past, reshape the narratives, and impose them on the local public. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, the fascinating case studies, and also raising ideas about, what is the difference of this post-socialist nostalgia versus post-communist nostalgia, maybe in these other parts of Eastern Europe, whether it's the museums that are in Prague, or in the GDR Museum in Berlin, or in Croatia. There are also a few that deal with it. So that's maybe some questions we can compare in the discussion period. And also the use of this Immortal Regiment, which has also made its way into the former Yugoslavia and used in Croatia as a very anti-fascist thing, or in Serbia and the Republika Srpska as a pro-Russian demonstration. So it's a great example. Now we go back to the Caucasus, and Marat Iliyasov, who should be with us online. If we can pull him up. Hello?
Hey, can you hear me?
Okay. Marat earned his PhD from the School of International Relations at the University of St. Andrews, and he continues to collaborate with them. He has 2 MAs from Vilnius and from Ilia State in Georgia, and he is currently a visiting scholar at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, which is where I believe you're zooming in from, maybe. Yeah? Well, Wisconsin-Russia Project. And his work is situated at the crossroads of many strands of international relations, such as peace and war, political demography, religious radicalization and de-radicalization, migration and identity, and, of course, memory politics. He's published quite a bit in a number of journals, and in his work he's exploring the possibilities of sustainable peace in Chechnya, attaching this question to the current memory politics and demographic trends that are observable in the Republic. And I think this is, quite a timely presentation, and called the Clash of Collective Memories in Post-War Chechnya. So, Marat, you have 20 minutes.
Thank you very much for your nice introduction, and thank you for having me. Can you see the screen?
Yes.
Did I share it? Everyone sees it?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So, yeah, my paper is called The Clash of Collective Memories in Post-War Chechnya. The presentation I called a little bit different, but it's the same presentation on the same paper. And the paper explores 2 political projects and 2 interpretations of Chechen collective memories, and explores the points where these collective memories coincide and where they clash. So the first of these political projects is of Proindependence Chechnya, and here on the paper, on the slide, you can see the first Chechen president who declared Chechen independence in 1991, Jahar Dudayev, and the independence flag of Chechen nation. The interpretation that this political project is based on considers the relations with Russia. So it's Chechen people or Chechen nation against Russian state. So it considers this relation as being conflictual, and this conflict continues according to different narratives for several hundred years. So some people go as far as 400 years, other people restrict themselves with a couple of 100 years, but the essence is that the conflict was there for decades and centuries. It is also based on the narrative and discourse of trauma, the traumatic experience of Chechen deportation that were in 1944. The whole nation was deported to Central Asia, and a lot of people died because of this. And this became chosen trauma for the nation. So this is another narrative that the project of pro-independence is based on. The third narrative is the narrative of suppression of culture, of suppression of language, suppression of ethnic identity that happened during the Soviet times, where Chechens were subject of pretty much assimilatory policy of Moscow. And even though maybe it was not that harsh, let's say, if you measure it, I don't know, with some other instruments, the threat of it was always emphasized by the pro-independence leaders, saying that we will lose our ethnic identity if we do not receive our independence, if we do not build our independent states, if we do not gain the recognition from the world. Same with the narrative of trauma. So the idea was that we do not want to repetition of this traumatic experience, and therefore we need our independent states. And same is the idea of the conflict. So we need to finish this conflict, and to finish this conflict, we need to be independent. So all these narratives are aiming at a recognition of Chechnya as an independent political entity. There is one project that is also kind of basing its idea on of independence, but it is Islamist project of Chechnya. There are some Islamist Chechens that would pursue this and would see Chechnya as independent Islamic state, but it is not based on collective memory, and therefore it is not included in this paper and this presentation. So the second project that I analyze is political project pro-Russian, we can say so. It's current Chechen elite that was created by the Kremlin in the recent last 20 years with the beginning of the Second Chechen War. And this project is also based on the same Chechen collective memories, but they interpret them differently. And to a large extent, this collective memory is aiming to analyze and maybe, to use this word, tarnish the pro-independence project. So the actual target of the current memory politics is last 20 years. So reinterpretation of why the war happened, who was behind it, and of course they blame pro-independence party for this. Nevertheless, they consider also the other parts of Chechen collective memory, and they also, interestingly enough, they are promoting Chechen culture and Chechen language, but it is again supposed to be within the Russian Federation, and they always emphasize that Russia, current Russia, differently than Soviet Union, differently than Imperial Russia, provide all possibilities to promote Chechen ethnic identity. One other big narrative that they also are very keen in promoting is their achievements in the sphere of security and stability, which they, of course, take the credit for, saying that that was us who created this stability, that was us that created this security. Chechnya became the most safety haven, basically, the most safe place in the world, that is their claim. And to go further and explain the parts of collective memory that both political projects are aiming at, I want first to talk about the goals of these both projects. So, of course, they are both political, and of course, they both aim at taking over the political power in Chechnya. And the one political project, as I mentioned, it's pretty much is the justification of secession, of Chechen secession from Russia and achieving independence, whereas the second pro-Russian political project is pretty much justification of Chechnya being a part of Russia, and of course them preventing the regime from being removed from power. Methodology of this research is related to the objectives of the paper and their form. So with the paper, I try to first to identify the parts of collective memory of the Chechens. Then I try to analyze the politics of memory that were pursued by these two political elites that I have mentioned. And third goal is to analyze memory-loaded narratives that these political elites produce. And the last is to explore the population's reactions to these narratives. Having in mind these goals, I try to focus on political discourses. For these reasons, I use some of them very probably one of the most popular talks that happened and were recorded and published on YouTube. They collected up to from several 100,000 views to up to more than 1 million views. And having in mind the size of Chechen nation, which is a little bit more than 1.5 million population, it's quite sizable. I also try to analyze memorialization efforts by both political elites, which include building monuments, analyzing what kind of monuments they were, what kind of ceremonies were also in place during the time in power, who are the heroes of these political elites, and etc., etc. And to do so, I use, of course, secondary literature as well as primary sources, like, again, political narratives that are published on YouTube and memorials. And my theoretical background for this project, in order not to overwhelm you with all the theoretical parts, I will just say that pretty much the idea is we are what we remember, and this is the foundation of the theory that I will use. Of course, I try to see what are the distinctions can be made in the population, and I acknowledge that there are different memories of different generations. So we still have people who were born in Soviet Union and who are old enough to remember and have nostalgia to the Soviet Union. At the same time, the same generation can be very anti-Soviet and have very anti-Soviet memories. We have quite a lot of population who are not anti-Soviet, but rather anti-Russian. The distinction is also quite important, because sometimes people in my interviews, they would consider that Soviet Union was much better state than Russia is, and all of these people have memory of deportation. As I have mentioned, this is the chosen trauma for the Chechens. I use some also interviews. So for I use my field work that I've done in between 2014 to 2018, then I extended it to 2020. More or less, I collected some interviews in Chechnya and in Europe among the first-generation migrants, and that also contributed to the understanding of what Chechen population, how it perceives and what it thinks about the memory politics that is pursued by these two elites that I have mentioned. Coming to the results of this research, so I have this table created to explain you what are the parts of Chechen collective memory, what Chechen collective memory, which part it consists of. So we have the period of late 18th century, that was the one of the first clashes, maybe one of the first wars, resistance against advancing Russian Empire to the Caucasus, and this was led by a Chechen called Mansur. He had this religious title of Sheikh, and he fought, as you can see, for 6 years, more or less. He managed to unite many North Caucasians under his flag, under his banners, and this is probably one of the earliest and one of the parts of Chechen collective memory that I could identify, because some people do remember this. It's not that they do remember it in the oral history, in the saying that my grandfather was part of Mansur's forces. No, they do remember it from the later research, from the published works. So it's rather a knowledge than collective memory, but still it's kind of transformed into memory, because everyone knows the name Sheikh Mansur, even if they do not know much of details about who was he and why he is important. They know that he was important, and of course both governments promoting the personality of Sheikh Mansur kind of popularized this figure. The difference in between approaches is as it follows. So pro-independence group put a lot of significance into his personality, saying that this was the guy who started resistance and who united, who tried to decolonize the Caucasus from Russia during the empire. Whereas pro-Russian group says, okay, it was war, he was the leader, and it was pertaining to the situation. Tell me any kind of place in the world where there wouldn't be similar situation. But today Russia is different, and of course we do not need to fight Russia. That's their narrative. The second part of Chechen collective memory is Caucasian War, which is already 19th century, and this is the longest war in Russian history. It lasted more than 60 years, as Russian historians say. And interestingly enough, both elites of both these projects are quite similar in approach to this war, in approach to this memory. So they see it in the same light, and this is one can discern it from the idea that there was a memorial initiated by pro-independence government in the early 90s that would commemorate the memory of massacre of one village there. And this memorial was not finished because the war started with Russia at that time. And then pro-Russian group finished this memorial actually. So they see the same approach. And the same approach goes to the leader of this war, who was Imam Shamil that time. And I believe that happened because he was not of Chechen origin, he was Dagestani. And both pro-independence and pro-Russian elites, they consider him as probably not in a very favorable light, to put it politely. So this part of collective memories pretty much coincide, and both of this, as you can see, are the parts that there is no big clash actually in between two elites. And this is because none of these parts of collective memories is considered by pro-Russian group as being explosive, as bringing a problem to them, as bringing danger to their position. The last two parts of collective memory that I have identified is the deportation memory. Of deportation, I have mentioned it as a chosen trauma, and the memory of the last wars with Russia. So these two memories are quite explosive. These two memories are quite powerful, and therefore the clash happens the biggest in between the interpretation of these two memories and the approach that two political elites have to this. So with the pro-Russian group, we see only limited approach to commemorate it. They are rather pursue policy of oblivion than a policy of memorialization of this collective memory. To do so, they merged the memorial that was built during Chechen independent time, de facto independence, to the victims of deportation. They merged it with the new memorial that would commemorate memory
Marat,
of those who. Yes.
3 minutes.
Okay. Yeah. So commemorate the memory of those who were fighting on the side of Russia against those who were pro-independent. And by this merger, they took away the significance of this memorial. And you can always see that they try to avoid talk to this. They moved also the date of the commemoration of this memorial of the victims, even if they already took away the significance, they still kind of understand that people would like to commemorate this date as it was quite a significant event for the Chechens. So they moved this not to the date when the deportation actually started, but to the later date. And the same potential has the Russo-Chechen wars of the last decades. And here the interpretation goes because current Chechen elite tries to win hearts and minds of the Chechen population by promoting themselves as those who brought peace to Chechnya, opposite to the previous elite that actually was war kind of elite. So these are pretty much my findings, and if you will have any further questions regarding this research, I will be happy to answer. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you for that presentation. I mean, it's quite fascinating to see the memory politics that Kadyrov and that Chechen political elite need to create, especially with the current war also in Ukraine. It was quite enlightening, the details. And now for our final paper. It's by Dimitrije Matić, and now we're going to the Balkans. And he has his master's from the University of Belgrade, and he worked with Dubravka Stojanovic, who's still his PhD advisor. He's a PhD candidate, also at the University of Belgrade, and since 2019. And he's been working at the Institute for Recent, not Resent, History, Recent History of Serbia in Belgrade. And I think he's also, according to this bio, he's an editor-in-chief of a journal for postgraduates and early career researchers. And now we'll also see the influence of Russia on Serbian memory politics, and it's quite interesting from the abstract. Looking forward to this, and it's the role of Russia and the EU in shaping Serbian memory of the Second World War. So this is also maybe similar to the Georgian push and pull, the different options. Dimitrije.
This works? Yeah. Right. Yeah. Okay, let me begin by first presenting the politics of memory in Serbia in the past 20 and even 30 years. So we can see Serbia clashed between the two most important external factors in the past 30 years. First of all, I need to explain the politics of memory within, so the domestic context. So in order to analyze Russia and EU and their influence in Serbia. So we can split the politics of memory into two most important eras for the past 30 years, the first one being Milosevic era. As I don't know if you're familiar with it, but Milosevic was basically he just transformed the country from a single party into a multi-party system. The Communist Party changed its name into a socialist party, and he continued governing by winning elections. So we can see that what was the memory of the Second World War in Serbia at that time. Partisans, the communist fighters, were deprived of their Yugoslav dimension, so they were reduced to Serbs and Serbian fight. It was a fight against fascism and genocide, genocide being committed by other Yugoslav nations and foreign occupiers. So, but we can see that other nationalist forces from World War II, especially Serbian, were tolerated by the government, but they were not celebrated openly. They were celebrated by certain opposition forces. But we can see that this drastically changed after 2000, where Milosevic's authority was overthrown. So we can see the democratic opposition of Serbia, DOS, it was actually a it was a heterogeneous coalition of 18 parties and movements, so it was kind of really diverse. But we can see that it had a strong anti-communist consensus. So that reflected onto the politics of memory, and specifically Chetniks, the forces that were probably the hardest to define on the former Yugoslav territory. They were Serbian nationalist forces that were established. It was a movement established in 1941 to fight against the occupiers, but they gradually evolved into collaborationist forces with their on and off collaboration, with their waiting strategy, basically waiting for the allies, especially Western allies, to liberate the country. They did have some fighting action also against the occupiers as well, so they have elements of both being a resistance movement and a collaborationist force. So we can see that Chetniks become ideal ancestors due to three reasons: being a resistance movement, enjoying the support of allies until 1943-44, when this support of the allies switched to the partisans, and of course being the victims of the post-war repression by the communists. We can see this was the monument to the Chetnik leader Draža Mihajlović, erected in 1992, so the early Milosevic period, which was erected in this shape and form. It was not disturbed by the government, and later on seldomly celebrated during the democratic era. So this was the official narrative after 2000. There were two anti-fascist movements of the Serbian people, partisans and Chetniks, and we can see that that becomes an official narrative through mostly legal measures. Official holidays from the socialist and Milosevic era were replaced. Chetniks and partisans were equalized by the change of the law of the fighters. Commissions were established in 2009 with the task of exhuming mass graves and the victims of communism, mostly Chetnik-oriented and towards the victims of the Chetnik movements, while other victims were mostly marginalized. We can see also two laws on rehabilitation from 2006 and 2011, which were also important. These measures sparked a huge debate. Supporters of those measures, especially the ones working with the government, they saw this as an important step towards democratization, decommunization, and bringing justice to the victims. While they criticized the measures for being incomplete, half-hearted, and without firm government support. So they wanted more of these measures and more in-depth actions. while the opponents claimed that this was the historical revisionism, actually, that intended to equalize anti-fascists and collaborators, that to portray communism and Nazism as equally tragic and equally bad for the Serbs, as well to promote and provide legitimization, historical legitimization for the Serbian nationalism employed by those forces that the Serbian state tried to rehabilitate. We can see their narrative more detailedly explained in the further slides. When we come to the actual politics of memory promoted by the EU and Russia, what happens with the EU memory framework, how we can determine, and what were the main characteristics of it? We can see that resolutions and decisions by the European Commission, by the European Parliament, and of course, first of all, Council of Europe. Even though Council of Europe is not an EU institution, it remains a strong memory agent on this occasion. We can see some of the key decisions and resolutions that were implemented in the EU and broader between 2000 and 2014. Of course, there are resolutions and decisions before that and after that, but this was the time frame of my work, of my paper. So this is the most important policies that were implemented during those times. We can see what also happened, how the EU memory framework was implemented in Serbia through many political changes and decisions. This was the image of Zoran Đinđić, the first democratically elected Prime Minister of Serbia in 2001. This picture was from 4 years prior, in 1997, when opposition won the elections and formed the government in the city of Belgrade. They managed to take down the Red Star from atop of the city parliament while announcing their new politics of memory that became official on a state level in 2001. We can see that DOS, or the democratic authorities, viewed the period between 1944 and 2000 as a single period, as an uninterrupted line of communist dictatorship and repression, viewing Milosevic just as another successor of Tito and his repression. We can see that anti-totalitarian paradigm that was being used in Europe for quite a few years ago and decades ago, that was used to portray the communists in an exclusively negative way. So it was implemented similarly as in other post-communist states. So they were perceived mostly as perpetrators of mass atrocities, and as well certain collaborators from the World War II period, where their crimes were relativized and changed. The context was changed. So we can see Chetniks become ideal ancestors, their image being cleansed of the undesirable traits such as the extent of collaboration, war crimes, and as well being adherents of strong Serbian nationalism. Holocaust remembrance also was one of the most important legacies of the EU, of the implementation of EU policies. We can see that it forced, to a certain degree, Serbia to come to terms with its own legacy of the Holocaust, which was being neglected for several decades now. We can see that the Holocaust memory was revived. This was the main concentration camp where most of the Jews lost their lives in 1941 and 42. This was unfortunately the state of the camp up until a year ago. Now it's under reconstruction. But we can see the decades-long neglect. We can see that it started being reformed, and that this neglect was being more publicly debated in Serbia since then. Unfortunately, not many was done on this occasion up until a year ago. We can see the discourse that was being used. What are the true European values that were promoted by memory agents? We can see on this occasion that pro-Chetnik right-wing memory agents, mostly on intellectuals, artists, certain politicians of moderate right, they perceive, of course, government measures as inadequate, but they use Europeanization discourse to criticize the government. As one historian said, it's our European obligation to deal with the consequences of communist dictatorship, especially directed towards the exhuming of mass graves. However, we can see another opposing opinion by the left liberal memory agents, certain NGOs as well as intellectuals, sociologists, historians, and many others who perceive anti-fascism as the key value that Europe offers. So they prefer anti-fascism instead of anti-totalitarianism. They firmly reject the resolution 1481 of the Council of Europe regarding the condemnation of the communist totalitarianisms. We can see that they actually claim that historical revisionism promoted both in certain countries of Europe and in Serbia blurred the line between partisans, their multi-ethnic war struggle, and extreme nationalist forces. All of this pushes the country further away from the European values and what the Europe truly stands for. On the other hand, we have Russia with a different type of influence. It didn't start as early as 2000. We can see certain chronological developments that occurred in later times. So we can see that for Russia, the victory over Nazism and fascism is actually a strong, it has a strong identity component, and the victory in World War II actually presents an important source of national pride. Victory Day being as the prime commemorative practice in modern day Russia, as well as in the former Soviet Union. However, the liberation, as we have said before, as we have mentioned before, the liberation of 1944-45, it was reduced to a tragic experience. It was reduced to solely to the post-war repression and perceived only through that lens. So it was undesirable to be mentioned or to be celebrated by the public officials. However, we can see that in 2007, Russo-Serbian alliance becomes stronger for many reasons. Economic ties become important. Declaration of Kosovo's independence was approaching. Serbia needed a strong political ally, and we can see that it started gradually to change. The stronger ties gradually moved to the field of memory, especially what was interesting that they found a common history, a joint politics of memory in the liberation of Belgrade. Belgrade was liberated on 20th of October 1944 by the joint efforts of the Yugoslav partisans and the Red Army. So we can see the two visits by the Russian state delegation as the most important. The first one being in 2009 when Russian President Dmitrije Medvedev visited Belgrade on the occasion of the liberation of Belgrade. We can see that many measures were adopted at that time. Neglected Liberators Cemetery was renovated, presidents paid their respects to the fighters. Official commemorative ceremony was prepared for Medvedev and his counselors, and after the visit, certain names of the Red Army generals were reintroduced into the city streets. So we can see that firm anti-communism from early 2000 was being toned down, and it was actually quite a debatable subject because the commemorative ceremony actually involved both partisan and Chetnik insignia, even though Chetniks had nothing to do with the liberation of Belgrade. So it was kind of an amalgamation of the World War II experience, and without firm identity politics or anything that was clearly coherent in the historical research. We cannot see a clear definition of what Serbia was trying to do with that ceremony. This was in 2009 in the National Theater of Belgrade, and we can see new phase happening since 2012. Serbian Progressive Party came to power, Aleksandar Vučić becoming more and more powerful. We can see that, of course, in 2013, and especially in 2014, the war in Ukraine started, and we can see that both in Serbia and Russia things changed. So we can see that in 2014, a new important ceremony was being held in Belgrade. Vladimir Putin and Sergei Lavrov visited Belgrade in October 2014. We can see that it was the first military parade for the occasion, the first one since the 1980s. And we can see the most important part of Putin's speech in 2014. We can see that he stressed the importance of battle against Nazism at all times and battle against contemporary historical revisionism. That was a clear reference to Ukraine and their ideological stance as perceived by Putin. Then further he mentions that Moscow would never give up on its allies from World War II and anti-Hitler coalition, referring to the West and his perceptions of this alliance and what it should mean in these times. These are some photos from, I'm near conclusion. These were some of the photos from the visit in 2014. And we can see that domestic factors actually played a dominant role in determining Serbian politics of memory between 2000 and 2014. Foreign mnemonic influences remained important in this period. However, domestic factors proved to be dominant, and foreign influences had to be adapted to the domestic internal context. So we can see that internal political and ideological upheavals spilled over into the field of historical memory, which caused some inconsistent remembrance practices. Like I mentioned, in 2009, both partisan and Chetnik insignia and songs were prepared for the occasion for the celebration of the liberation of Belgrade. We can see that Second World War presents a crucial mnemonic reference for both EU and Russia. It's influenced greatly Serbia's attempt to incorporate its own historical experience into the greater narrative, European and world narrative that EU and Russia have. Serbia tried to find its own place within these greater mnemonic narratives. However, the domestic context, the internal factors proved to be dominant in the way, and actually the decisive factor in determining how this experience would be implemented, both in domestic and international context. So, thank you.
Thank you for that presentation on the challenges of World War II commemoration in the former Yugoslavia, and specifically Serbia. And not only was using Chetnik insignia at that commemoration, but also not mentioning Tito apparently in the last couple of. So it's also that amnesia, like somehow Tito has been removed from that formula. Now we turn to our discussant, who's online. I think she's available, who has the challenging job of bringing together all the threads of these great papers and presentations. Hello. Hello there.
Hi. Hello.
Now I'm probably going to Dovile Budryte. Okay, is a professor of political science at Georgia Gwinnett College. Before that, she was a fellow at the College for Advanced Central European Studies at Europa University Vjeran in Frankfurt an Oder. And her current areas of interest comprise gender studies, trauma and memory in international relations. We have plenty of that in today's papers. And nationalism. And one of her latest papers is Memory Politics and the Study of Crises in International Relations, Insights from Ukraine and Lithuania. So also a very timely research paper. So please, if you could comment our presentations. You have about 20 minutes.
Thank you so very much. It's a great pleasure and a great honor to be part of this fascinating conference. And as you can see, I had an opportunity to comment on very rich and very interesting papers indeed. I'll offer some insights about the common themes for the papers, and then I will comment on individual papers and also have some questions for the presenters. So clearly the papers deal with the intersection between foreign policy and memory. This is especially true in Tamar's paper, Dimitrije's paper, and Zarina and Aijan's paper also. Probably one of the takeaways for all of us would be that memory indeed is complex. Its formation has to do with both domestic factors and international factors, and especially international factors are important in the case of perhaps the states that could be described as ontologically insecure in our region in Eastern Europe. So perhaps it's not surprising that the common denominator in these papers would be Russia, right? It could be perceived as an enemy, as in Tamar's paper. There are attempts to construct a memory resisting Russia. However, the role of Russia is probably a little bit more ambiguous in the other papers. Tamar's paper outlines the dynamics of securitization of memory when tense relations with Russian foreign policy coincide with memory wars. And it becomes very clear that it's impossible to separate memory politics from international politics. We also see the importance of the so-called weak actors in international relations, states such as Georgia, but also huge importance of their resistance politics. Russia's important influence can be seen in shaping Kyrgyzstan's identity. In this case, hybridity of memory with attempts to resist Russia's influence and also embrace it at the same time. And these dynamics I found especially interesting. Serbia's case and Dimitrije's paper described would be as a memory alliance between Serbia and Russia. And both Serbia and Russia embrace, quote, a messianic understanding of their historical and international roles, defending historical truth against a perceived enemy. So I think this kind of formation of collective identity between Russia and Serbia is very interesting, this vicarious identification with each other. In Marat's paper, Russia was perceived as a source of conflict, but also he talked about a pro-Russian project within Chechnya. So it's interesting to see different roles that Russia can play in just one case. So when talking about the Russian factor, the question is, what does it tell us about memory formation and conceptualization of memory in international relations? And here I think what the papers tell us about would be the interaction between a bigger state, Russia, and smaller states. And memory becomes a product of these international interactions. And one takeaway, at least for me, would be to make sure that we pay attention and study the resistance politics of small states, which very often we forget to do when we study international relations and tend to focus only on the quote-unquote great powers. So therefore, I would like to suggest that all of these cases are very interesting in and of themselves as case studies, and we rarely hear about cases such as Kyrgyzstan, Georgia, or Chechnya in memory studies in particular. So some papers also mention the impact of war in Ukraine on the development of memory politics in the States, and this topic about this fundamental influence of the current war could probably be expanded. It seems to me that war in Ukraine is another critical situation that probably affected development of memory in all cases. In addition, these rich papers provide many other important insights and raise important questions. So I'm going to talk about each paper in a little bit more detail now. Tamar's paper sets out to study memory as a top-down construction process, and it identifies 3 phases of memory in Georgia corresponding with the 3 presidents of Georgia. It's clear that the role of presidents is very important. However, I think it may be useful to theorize it a bit more. Could we say that these presidents were agents of memory? If so, what kind of agents of memory? Why are they so important? What is the relationship between their leadership style, their political leadership style, and the type of memory regime that was developed during their presidencies? The periodization in the paper itself suggests that perhaps it was not just about the presidents and their influence, but also critical events played a major role as well. So the Rose Revolution in 2003, and also Georgia's decision to choose a westward orientation. And it seems to me that one question which perhaps could be explored a little bit more in the paper would be which factor is actually more important for the type of memory regime that emerges in Georgia, the role of individual presidents or the role of these events, such as the Rose Revolution. To strengthen the theoretical foundation of the paper, it may be useful to treat critical moments such as the Rose Revolution as engines of discourses. And that's Dirk Neighbor's work on crisis might be useful for the development of the theoretical framework. During these critical moments, such as the Rose Revolution, new discourses are released and new identities are created. We clearly see in the speeches of President Saakashvili, this creation of memory regime focusing on unity, united we stand, focusing on evocation of national heroes, this impact of the critical events. That would probably help to describe methodology a bit more in the paper. I realize that this is work in progress, but it would be very, very useful to define the approach which is taken in this paper. So these critical events, such as the Rose Revolution, coincide not only with the release of new discourses, but also patterns of relation with Russia, transforming bilateral interactions. These critical events also produce new patterns of commemoration, such as the creation of the Occupation Museum, which, according to the paper, was following the example of the Baltic states. To me, this was a very interesting part of the paper about the diffusion of memory practices, and we don't see this much in the literature on memory, right? How the experience of the Baltic states was replicated in Georgia. That was fascinating. Perhaps this section could be better developed. There are some unanswered questions. Who and why chose the Baltic states for the occupation memory template? Which ones of the Baltic states were chosen and why? Here I should mention that the 3 Baltic states have different models of commemoration, with Lithuania more likely to use the terminology of genocide to refer to Stalin's crimes, and Latvia and Estonia using the terminology associated with occupation. By choosing this model, the so-called Baltic model, how did Georgia conceptualize the entire Soviet period? Was there a temptation, like in the case of the Baltic states, to externalize the Soviet experience, right, and associate oneself with victim only? By doing that, was there a temptation to perhaps even deny cooperation with the Soviet regime? Another valuable part of the paper is the description of transitional justice mechanisms in Georgia. This could be perhaps even a separate paper. The transitional justice mechanisms in the former Soviet Union are still not very well researched, and this could be perhaps a very interesting and original contribution to the literature. The section discussing transitional justice is relatively short. It remains unclear how these transitional justice laws were actually implemented. Did lustration and other transitional justice strategies end up opening old wounds in society? Or would you say that it was a positive development towards a stronger democracy? The paper briefly mentions that the creation of commission and its accelerated work pace, I quote, became reasons for societal criticism, but it's unclear why this happened. And again, does it actually help to introduce some democratic norms and make the democratic transition easier? In sum, this case seemed to suggest how Georgia's memory regime evolved and became similar to the regimes prevalent in other Eastern European states, such as the Baltic states, and it demonstrates very clearly the influence of geopolitical orientations on memory formation. The insight that memory created not only for domestic consumption, but for foreign consumption is important, and this conclusion could be definitely further developed. So let me go to the second paper now, Zarina Adambusinova's and Aijan Sharshenova's paper, Memory Sites, Post-Soviet Nostalgia in Bishkek and Russian Public Diplomacy. And this paper, once again, just like the previous paper, also highlights important intersections between geopolitical orientations and memory formations, which I think it's very useful. Unlike Georgia, Kyrgyzstan has remained in Russia's zone of influence instead of choosing the path to resemble the so-called Western democracies. Thus, the focus here is on Soviet nostalgia. The paper attempts to establish a focus on the places of memory, or as memory sites, and it stated that the phenomenon of Soviet nostalgia explored through several of such sites: the Russian Drama Theater, the Home Museum of Mikhail Frunze, and the Immortal Regiment. However, these sites are not merely the sites, but also the authors sometimes refer to them as practices as well. So in my eyes, it may be very useful to clarify this relationship between memory sites and related practices. How do these related practices develop? I assume that those practices would be related to Soviet nostalgia. Why and how were these particular sites chosen, and why and how do we focus on these particular practices? It appears that the paper is primarily interested not just in the sites of memory, but also in the instrumentalization of practices associated with Soviet nostalgia, not only by the domestic actors, but also by Russia. Focusing on the instrumentalization of Soviet nostalgia as an instrument of Russia's influence is an important contribution to memory studies. It helps to gain insight into the questions on how states are engaged in norm transmission, in this particular case, Russia. Perhaps Russia's attempts to instrumentalize the Soviet nostalgia could be made into a separate paper, or perhaps into a theoretical focus of the paper. This would be a different focus from the sites of memory, because right now it looks like the paper is trying to do many things at the same time. I was a bit intrigued by the statement that, and I quote here, the Soviet past remains a valid memory politics tool abroad. This raises interesting questions about valid and perhaps invalid, right? Memory tools in foreign policy. So some tools are accepted and some are not, right? So what would be an example of a non-valid or invalid memory tool abroad, right? Why is the Soviet past a valid memory tool? And what could be the context too for these uses of tools? In other contexts, such as Georgia and the Baltic states, the perception of such use of memory, right, Russia basically using the so-called Soviet shared past, would be very different. It would be obviously rejected. What makes this instrumentalization of the Soviet nostalgia by Russia different from mnemonic imperialism, right? A tool to keep the former Soviet republics in Russia's zone of influence. So why is this considered to be a valid tool? A very interesting part of the paper is the discussion of the impact of the war in Ukraine on memory politics and identity formation in Kyrgyzstan. The descriptions of the mnemonic practices related to the Immortal Regiment in 2022 is fascinating. It demonstrates hybridity of memory related to World War II in Kyrgyzstan. The section about the controversies related to the many interpretations of World War II could definitely be expanded. It would be interesting to learn what the authors think about the long-term impact of the war in Ukraine. How will this war affect memories related to the Soviet nostalgia in Kyrgyzstan? The Russian public diplomacy related to World War II is also one of the foci for Dimitrije Matić's paper, The Role of Russia and the EU in Shaping Serbian Memory of the Second World War. Similarly to Kyrgyzstan, Serbia has a more positive attitude towards Russia than Georgia. Thus, this paper describes a type of memory alliance emerging between the two countries. Some of the most interesting parts of this paper is to explore what Dirk Moses calls partisan memory, which is to say the memory about the actual partisans, such as the Chetniks, and memory battles surrounding these partisan memories, or the development of the so-called partisan memory. It may be useful to draw on Moses's term when discussing memory battles surrounding the memory of Chetniks in Serbia. That could definitely enrich the theoretical basis of the paper. One of the most interesting parts of the paper is the section discussing the influence of the European Union on Serbia, which introduced the focus on the Holocaust victims. It is argued that the significance of the transnational memory and the importance of the Holocaust remembrance within the EU indirectly or directly forced Serbia to come to terms with its own legacy regarding this matter. And I quoted here from page 4 of the paper. This is an interesting observation. However, if this influence was indirect, right, if the EU influence was indirect, then how was it transmitted? In the case of the other Central European states, such as the Baltic states, the European Union used conditionality, and the impact on memory politics perhaps was much more direct. So a question, which is a very interesting question, not perhaps specifically addressed in the paper, would be, why did Serbia listen to the EU? In other words, the mechanism by which this transnational memory was transmitted or communicated could be described. In contrast, we see much more information in the paper about the ways in which Russia acted as an external memory agent in Serbia. The intersection between geopolitics, specifically the emerging alliance between Russia and Serbia, and memory alliance becomes very clear. Here, once again, it may be useful to use the concept of critical junctures, such as 2013 crisis in Ukraine, to trace the development in memory regimes. In this case, 2013-2014 crisis promoted the development of memory alliance between Russia and Serbia. One question still remains, and perhaps I realize that the paper stopped with 2014, but perhaps it would be very interesting to think about how the current war has affected this Russian-Serbian alliance. And if Ukraine wins, what will happen to this alliance? One quick point about the conclusion, it could be better related to the analysis presented in the paper. The paper talked about the EU and Russia. However, the conclusion is somewhat sudden and unexpected, suggesting that internal actors mattered more, right? So which internal aspects, why did they matter more than external aspects? Because the analysis in the paper focuses on the external actors, so I was a bit perplexed by the conclusion. So finally, to Marat's presentation, I think it's a very interesting interpretation of Chechnya's history and memory politics, and it looks like the paper focuses on both domestic and international aspects including the Chechen diaspora in the West. So I think one question that I kept thinking about when listening to the presentation was, is there a central trauma in memory politics in Chechnya, right? This central trauma would be essential for the development of nationhood. And it looks like, again, there are these separate narratives, distinct actors, and it looks like there's no one trauma uniting all Chechens. So it might be also very, very useful to kind of focus on the most important actors for the development of memory politics in Chechnya, perhaps use the term of memory entrepreneurs, and also develop a bit more of a theoretical conceptualization about how memory is made and how these actors, these various actors, exercise their influence. I'm kind of left with the question, how many collective memories are there in Chechnya and among diaspora? Perhaps it might be useful to use the concept of official memory and also subnational memories, right? Probably one of the most important and interesting contributions of Marat's work would be the focus on diasporic memory and its influence. Perhaps it's not surprising that memory of Chechen diaspora would conflict with the official memory of Chechnya. So in sum, probably a very important contribution of Marat's presentation would be to see what happens when there's no hegemonic narrative, no clear biography of a state, right? That we see this theory in ontological security studies, we see these separate narratives, many actors kind of competing with each other, right? So it helps to analyze the situation when there are competing narratives, right? In sum, I will stop here by saying that, again, a very, very important contribution of this panel and all of these cases would be that perhaps with partial exception of Serbia, these cases, we do not see them very often in memory studies. And therefore, I think that the papers hold a lot of promise for furthering the study of foreign policy and memory politics. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for those comments. I'm sure the authors appreciate them. There's definitely questions for the authors from you, but maybe we should collect a couple of from the audience, and then if you'd like to also comment on the discussion. Okay, we have one question here. No, you'll get a microphone. And also, anyone online, please send me questions on the chat.
Hi, I had a question relating to how Russia does seem to tie everything here together, and there is a methodology, it seems, to when Russia creates propaganda. Like from what I've been told, it's they accuse what the party of that they're affecting of what they're doing first. They muddy the waters. They do whataboutism. Is there a methodology that Russian influence within these post-Soviet possessions of Moscow, is there one in which they craft like a beneficial, is there a procedure for this? Is there a pattern? I know like with Ukraine right now, it's mass murder, deportations, and theft, like it seems to be, and taking kids, like that's one way to shape memory. By eradicating it. But is there, like in peacetime, has there been a method by which they're able to do this? Is it like through strategic corruption, or is it just because yeah, when you, Fiona Hill had mentioned that if Russia had any memory of those deportations, and I'm guessing there's not many of the people there still alive anymore, just as like Holocaust survivors are all dying off just because of biology, that the first Chechen War, the second Chechen War would probably not have happened if Russia knew about these. So, but there is a terrifying government there. People who do speak up do disappear. Same with Chechnya. The only space I would imagine people are able to discuss is outside of Chechnya. outside of Russia. So is there a method that they're able to craft how Russia is remembered, how Russia is perceived? Is there like a checklist like with the propaganda machine that?
Okay, thank you. Is there some other, a few more questions? All right, Douglas.
Hi, thank you all for some really great presentations, some very thoughtful, thought-provoking presentations. This is actually directed to Dimitrije and thinking about the way in which, again, Serbia facing EU pressures to address Holocaust remembrance issues, and then shifting their attention to, as well during this period, this totalitarian memory. And I wonder how much that was a bit entrepreneurial on the part of the Serbians. This is highlighted by the wonderful book by Jelena Sobotuk, and the way in which Serbia, among other countries, have been able to take the memories of their own collaboration or try to whitewash some of those memories of collaboration by shifting the attention to the atrocities of totalitarian regimes. And so our discussant, Dovile, raises the question about why would Serbia accept this? How much of that was because of external pressure from the EU, and how much of that was just wonderfully entrepreneurial, that they get an opportunity to, to shift the attention. They saw the opening, took it, and then therefore create this new memory that whitewashes some of their own collaboration.
Okay, we've got one more question over here, and
I have just two questions. One question is perhaps to all panelists can reply. I mean, is in your memory in Georgia or in Kyrgyzstan or in Chechen, do you have any imagination of the Russian colonial past that dates back to the 19th century or 18th century? So, I mean, then the recent memory of the Soviet occupation or whatever it is, and is there any efforts to connect this memory to the memory of Russian colonialism in 18th or 19th century? This is a question to all of us. And one specific question to Dmitry. I mean, in whatever it is, progressive party or a certain oppositional party, their memory orientation is visibly different and apparently different. But my question is, in your presentation, the one thing is missing, totally missing, memory of the recent civil war in former Yugoslavia. How that memory of civil war in former Yugoslavia is related with this sort of different approach to memories of Second World War. I mean that I read, I can't remember her name, the Jelena something. She wrote a book very recently, Red Star. Yeah. And actually, she explains very interesting the story of the Janušovac committee. Actually, some Serbian nationalists approach to Janušovac committee and in collaboration with even Yad Vashem, in a way of screen memory to cover up the atrocities they had during the civil war in former Yugoslavia. So, in a sense, I think that the memory of the former Yugoslavia in the civil war must be related with their different approach to the memories of the Second World War. So, can you explain a little bit about this?
Okay, Bartosz wants a question.
Yes, I have a short question to Dimitrije, a typical historical question. What are your sources, method, and was your paper connected with the PhD that you're writing? Thank you.
Okay, so we have a number of questions, and maybe each of the panelists, maybe in the reverse order. I mean, you can also choose to briefly respond to the discussants' questions as well. So.
Yeah, sure. First of all, thank you for your questions, and let me start off by the question about EU and the Holocaust remembrance. So the main question is, why did Serbia listen to the EU regarding the Holocaust? I mean, the same answer would be as in the case of Croatia and any other country that's on the EU accession path. I mean, they wanted to be there. They want to be the members of the EU. Remembrance regarding the Holocaust is a transnational one, so it encompasses many countries. I mean, it was particularly devastating in former Yugoslavia. I mean, 90 to 95% of the Jews were murdered only in the first year of the war. So, I mean, it's important for them. It was not like a hard pressure. No one pressured them, and it was not within the negotiation terms. So no one pressured directly Serbia to comply with the remembrance policies of the Holocaust. They just did it as a way of being part of Europe, being part, especially in Serbia. I mean, Milosevic's rule was pretty much devastating to the country. It meant that Serbia wanted to be a part of the world again. I mean, that was basically one of the main ideological pillars of the democratic regime of the after 2000, bringing Serbia back into the world. That was the official narrative. We can see also how did Dovile probably ask that, how did the current crisis and escalation of the war in 2022 influence this memory alliance? That's a whole another topic. I mean, it's I am still missing data, and I don't know how to answer this beyond the daily press, what the daily press publishes. It's quite an unusual story. So memory of the 1990s, that's another whole level of memory, remembrance. I mean, the intertwinement between memories of the Second World War, memories of the 90s, bilateral relations between former Yugoslav countries, relations with the EU and Russia, and how it all fits in. Russia having their own remembrance regarding the 90s. As we can see, it's especially enhanced since February, so it's a completely new level of it's a completely it's another topic. I mean, we could sit here and discuss for another 2 hours. I mean, it's such a big deal. And what Bartosz mentioned, the sources. Sources are pretty limited regarding the matter. I mean, I used press. I used the parliamentary debates. So it was kind of mostly literature, mostly historiography that was being published up until now regarding the matter. So it's quite a new topic, and it is related to my PhD, not directly part of my PhD per se. It's like an addition to a chapter, as I could point it out.
Okay, perhaps Marat, you could respond to any of the comments if you'd like.
I would like to thank Dovile first for her comments, very useful, and I think I will revise some of my research in this light. I do not actually have what to say to other questions. I do not have any comment regarding the particular methodology or sign that to research Russia. So I probably will skip this part to other presenters. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, thank you very much for your comments and questions. There was a question why particularly these cases. So basically, we set the field work and the research project originally to identify the pockets of Soviet memory. And we based it on our experience. Where do you walk in and feel like you jumped in a time machine and you felt like you're back in the Soviet Union? And that's when we felt that that's the museum, because the other museums, they are not as political as this one. Like this one is trying to be historical, purely historical. But because so many political issues are tied up in a single museum and single location, it is actually quite political. And then the Immortal Regiment, if you have ever walked or seen it, it literally is bringing you back into the tradition of the Soviet time parades, military parades and civilian parades. So in a way, it's both commemoration of the Soviet past, but also recreation of the Soviet past in the contemporary conditions, and also with the imagery, the visuals, the way people are dressed sometimes, because they usually dress kids in Second World War uniforms, which is quite terrifying. They have, the stars are quite prominent. You saw, there was a picture of Joseph Stalin. Somebody did not have an ancestor who participated in the war, so instead of carrying the portrait of their ancestor, they were carrying a portrait of Joseph Stalin, and that's a political statement per se as well. So we felt that these cases were the most Soviet ones, and the feeling in terms of why specifically 2 locations and 1 practice, we actually did a mapping of the post-Soviet pockets and anything Soviet that we would spot in different ways. It could be like an exchange bureau named as USSR, or it could be Sovietsky Plombier ice cream, it could be Zhigulovskaya Pivo brand. So quite a lot of like small things, but we realized some things are purely therapeutical. So that would be more relating to social psychology and political psychology, how people relieve the stress of living through transition, a political, economic, and cultural transition by escapism into the past. That's not exactly our field of study. Then there was a commercial part, as I said, like sex cells, obviously, but also Soviet Union cells. That would be more pertaining to the marketing and psychology of business. So again, that's not exactly our field. There was also past dependence. That's more political because some of the locations in Kyrgyzstan are still having very strong communist connotations. Like I live in a district in Bishkek, which is Oktyabrski. So it's October district. It has nothing to do with autumn and month. It has to do with the Great October of Socialist Revolution, which I, as a 36-year-old, cannot relate to because it's way back in the history. So I have not gone through the whole cycle of Soviet socialization to appreciate that part of history. So I don't feel emotive response to that. So that's why we thought to focus on the aspects of post-Soviet nostalgia and how it's used by external actors, namely Russia. There was a question as well about what is valid and invalid memory tools or foreign policy tools. Valid and invalid does not refer to good or bad. There is no moral judgment over there. It's more about the efficiency of the tool. Whether it invokes a certain emotive response from the part of the public, because public diplomacy is about state talking directly to the foreign publics. And they usually, like Zelensky was quoted today, Zelensky is really good at tailoring his messages to the history and values of the audience he talks to. Russia does a similar thing in a way clumsier way, though. So they emphasize the shared past, the Soviet cartoons, again, ice cream, the beer brands, the Soviet cars, the games of the Soviet childhood, the schools, the experience, the lived experiences of our parents and grandparents and so on and so forth. And that is invoking an emotive response from the part of a certain part of the Kyrgyz community nowadays. Not all of it, because again, Soviet society was not equal and it was not always successful in creating this Homo Sovieticus. But it does appeal to a certain audience, usually old people, usually ethnic minorities, usually not religious atheists or moderately religious people. So again, it's a very vast area to look at. I think I'd stop here because I can talk forever.
Thank you very much for the questions and comments. Actually, the first question was about the president as a memory actors, and I absolutely agree because every president had their unique experience. For example, first President Vjeran Gamsahurdia came from the national movement, and of course he was very free with speaking of the communication, the communization, the Sovietization, and etc. But unfortunately, he had a very short term of his presidency, only 2 years. And in case of Eduard Shevardnadze, he was a communist leader, pro-communist leader, and when he came to the power, of course, he could not start speaking about the lustration law and etc. But in case of why I have not chosen the Rose Revolution as a factor on the memory construction process, actually. Saakashvili's government wanted to create a Rose Revolution as a memory product. If those days you would enter to the occupation museum, you would see how the exhibition was ended. This was the corner of Rose Revolution, and they wanted to say that everything that was bad stays back, and from now, from the Rose Revolution, we are starting to build the statehood anew. And I want also to connect these two questions about what we remember from the colonial past and also the process of about the Commission of Creation Historical Trust. When Saakashvili's government initiated the establishment of the commission, they said that when we are speaking about the Russian crimes, we are speaking about the crimes that happened during the Soviet regime. But because of Georgia was occupied in the 19th century, we have to remember and recall those crimes and become the part of the collective memory. So we don't remember, we remember what was done during the Soviet Union, but before, no. And about the question of who chose what type of strategies should be used or what type of institution need to be created. Actually, the answer is that at the beginning of his presidency, Saakashvili changed the constitution, and he had huge power. Actually, it was a super presidential system, and the president at the very narrow circle around him could decide what type of policy needed to be initiated. Thank you.
Okay. Are there any more questions from the live audience or online? All right, and it's looking like a coffee break time. So if there aren't any final questions, then I will declare an end to the panel and the beginning of our coffee break. So see you there. Thank you.